Hello and welcome back to the Soldiers of Cinema podcast. This is our third episode. I'm Colin McFader, and today I'm joined by my lovely co-host, Clark Coffey.
Lovely. Oh, that's so sweet.
There you go.
Sweet. Thanks, man. I really appreciate that. That's awfully kind of you to say.
Yeah, so today we're going to be looking at Lesson 4 of the Herzog Masterclass, which is primarily about writing a script and kind of Herzog's takeaways on, the three-act structure and things like that, and his kind of criticisms of perhaps the way that people traditionally are taught to write scripts, but also some of his kind of stylistic differences, perhaps even between each of us, that maybe there's some points we disagree with or agree with.
Well, I'll tell you this. Just go so everybody knows. Cullen, so that you know, I'm just going to lay it all on the line here. I'm just going to tell you that I'm admitting that this is the scariest part of filmmaking to me. Mm-hmm. So this is a topic that, boy, I need to think more about, or maybe I need to think less about. But
yeah, there's the real question.
but this is this is the area in filmmaking where I feel like I am, confronting that blank page is probably actually, without question, it's the most terrifying aspect of filmmaking to me. So it's kind of a personal challenge that I'm still kind of working on, and I hear this from a lot of people that it is one of the more challenging aspects of filmmaking. So there's my admission here before we jump in.
Oh, absolutely. I can't imagine being someone who solely screenwrites as a career. That sounds terrifying to me.
It's an extraordinary gift. People who can write with consistent discipline just amaze me, and it's something that I'm trying to work up to myself. But yeah, and clearly, with the amount of, I don't know, what do you want to call them, self-help books or how-to books, or if you look at how many books have been written about how to write, clearly we're not the only ones who struggle with this challenge, because my goodness, that's an entire industry unto itself. And some of these books, of course, have kind of, become mainstays and are referenced all the time. And I guess that can kind of segue us right into, right off the bat, Herzog in this class just throws down the gauntlet as like 3-act structure, character arcs, who needs them?
yeah, which is the most Herzog thing.
Yeah, and which is interesting. So let's talk about that for a minute, because it's, I think when people are taught screenwriting, the 3-act structure, maybe a 5-act structure, but mostly for films, 3-act structure, beginning, middle, and end, character arcs, da 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 da. There's a tremendous amount of emphasis on this.
Yes.
Hey, what are your thoughts? And let's talk a little bit about our own personal experience here. But yeah, so Herzog says, throw it out, but what do you think?
I think similarly to a lot of the other things we've talked about, I think there's definitely a use in knowing kind of the rules, and then once you know the rules, you can kind of break them. And I think it's similar with writing, in that I think structure is important when you're starting out or when you're learning it, and even in a lot of larger scripts, I think that structure is very important. But I also think that if you know what you're doing, you can get away with writing a really compelling script that doesn't necessarily follow the format of a regular 3-act structure, or with character arcs and things like that. And some very, very mainstream movies kind of lack character arcs, and it's the talent of the screenwriter that really, I think you might have talked about this before, but like Back to the Future, technically Marty McFly at the beginning of that movie and at the end of the movie is essentially the same person. He hasn't really learned anything on a main character changing kind of scale.
That's George McFly is the character who goes through the arc in that film.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So I think on the merit of...
That was his name, right? Was that the name of the father?
Yes.
Is it George?
Yeah. What's his name? Playing
so it's interesting. Right. So there definitely are characters who have arcs, but you're right. I think Marty McFly in that instance didn't so much have the arc. It was his father, which is interesting. And Marty was a catalyst for... And I think you find that in quite a few films, actually, where the main character doesn't necessarily change much, but is a catalyst for the change of other characters in
I
the
mean, yeah,
film.
even these Sergio Leone westerns, like I
Sure.
mean, it's not like Clint Eastwood has
No,
a arc in any of those movies,
none.
but he definitely changes the settings around him and the
Yeah,
locales, and that's quite a common western kind of trope. Really, is that like this mysterious stranger that is technically the main
comes
character, the
in.
protagonist, does
Yeah,
not, have a real arc or set kind of development through the movie, but rather they're kind of more of a whirlwind.
yeah. So you're thinking. So just to kind of like summarize. So you're thinking it's good to know about, something that you should be aware of, but and you're kind of saying that maybe you should know about these things. It's kind of that old adage of like you should know what rules you're trying to bend or break before you try to bend or break them. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, because I think the one thing that these rules prevent is messiness,
Hmm.
and they're really helpful in streamlining ideas. So even if you go in to write a script that technically isn't a 3-act structure, and you kind of strip away that aspect of it, you can still use elements of that structure to streamline your script and to make sure that it's straightforward and
Yeah.
concise. Whereas the biggest issue I have with reading scripts from people who haven't, even in the class that I teach, if a kid writes a short film even that's 10 pages long,
Yeah.
and they very clearly don't have any sort of background knowledge on screenwriting, is that it's just kind of all over the place. It's one of those things that you don't really think about. Okay, what's even something as simple as just like cause and effect,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
can really easily miss out on, because I find that most people when they write kind of go into this trance where they have it all in their head and it might not necessarily
There's no
translate onto
question,
the
and I've
paper.
definitely seen that too. And I've seen it even, from moderately, intermediately experienced writers. There's no question. I want to like get a little philosophical here for a second, sort of, kind of. I have to say, I'm torn. I'm kind of sitting here exploring this idea with you and our listeners in real time. There's a part of me that thinks, it's in my own experience. I feel like a lot of my challenge is that I have spent too much time analyzing and conceptual, and kind of trying to wrap my head around storytelling conceptually, and I think that has led to a little bit of analysis paralysis for me. And there's, part of me that thinks that storytelling is an inherent capability within all of us, at least to some degree. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that writing would come naturally, but as far as talking about story structure, I feel like, story is not that this is some kind of revolutionary thought here, but, stories are just external manifestations of our internal psyches, right? These are just, when we write a story, it's basically putting down on paper how our brains kind of work as human beings, right? We go through life and take the experiences that we have and kind of present them to ourselves in a narrative, right? This is how we see our memories, that we're our main character in our film, and so this is, we build, like, we're just storytelling machines basically. It's how our brains work. And so I feel like it's, to a certain extent, there is this innate intuition, kind of intuitive understanding of story, right? If I think even young children, I mean, you can have them, tell me about what happened to your day, or, and so there's a part of me that's, that it's okay to an extent, this exists inside of us. And I think what Herzog, I mean, my interpretation is kind of like, where he's saying, look, if you spend so much time trying to intellectualize, conceptualize, analyze story, that there's a good chance you're going to get in your own way. And I think from
Yeah.
hearing him speak, that's what he's concerned about for himself, right? It's like, hey, I don't want to look too closely into this. If I start to dissect this stuff, I'm going to get self-conscious and I'm not going to be able to do it. And I think that's a big part of why he likes to write with such urgency, is because he doesn't even want to give himself a chance, right? To start like thinking about
Overthinking
writing,
and
right?
getting his own head. Yeah.
It's kind of like, look, just write. Don't think about it. Just write. And so so it's interesting. I mean, I think, and clearly there are a lot of people who think very differently, and maybe it just kind of comes down to what works for you. But there's another aspect of this too, which is like, I think one of the reasons his films are so unique and that his voice comes through so cleanly in them, is that he does write that way. It's a very intuitive way of writing. Whereas if he were to have, say, let's gone to film school and read a bunch of books on how to save the cat, or or story and all these things, and he sat down and had his he put his postcards or his 3x5s on the board and had his first,
and
second,
rearranged
third
all
act,
that.
and, okay, what's my inciting incident, or what's my his films would probably come out looking a whole lot like everybody else's films.
Yeah, definitely.
But then again, I think your point is really valid that, for people who don't understand story structure and how to put that into a script, then sometimes you just have a big mush of nothing. So I don't know. Like, I really honestly don't know. I think I'm torn on this myself.
Well, I think it's really interesting that you mentioned the thing about kids, too, because I think, honestly, if you think about it, the way that children learn to lie isn't through getting out of trouble or things like that. More often than not, it comes from exaggerating elements of a story.
Sure.
Like, I was on the playground today and my friend pulled out a sword and we fought goblins, right? And it's like, kids lie like that all the time, but they're not lying really. They're telling stories that
sure.
That they just don't see the...
It's flair. It's
yeah,
right.
Exactly.
They're adding to the dramatic effect. And so, yeah, and that's a good point too, right? And even going further than that, I mean, that right when you're a kid and you're playing with your toys and you have this little plastic figure, you build this entire imaginary world where, it's all these things are happening. Like if you're, playing army out in the backyard or something, which I don't know if kids still do that. I'm old, but when 40 years ago when I did that, I had my little G.I. Joe guys or something. I mean, you create this entire world, right? You've changed the setting and you've got these characters and that's storytelling. So I guess that's what I kind of mean, is that I feel like this is intuitive to a certain extent. I guess that doesn't automatically mean that would translate, okay, well, how do you take these ideas and put them into a written format and maximize their dramatic effect and make them compelling? And so, I think that you're probably right to some extent, that having some kind of conceptual understanding is really important. But probably each of us have to find our own balance of... over-analyzing versus, allowing your intuition come. My imagination is that the best of both worlds might be to find a way within yourself to understand intellectually and conceptually, but then to kind of turn that part off when you're writing and allow that intuitive subconscious to flow. Because I really do think that's where the amazing things happen. I mean, I love films that have a dreamlike logic quality, that aren't necessarily perfectly linear or make perfect sense rationally. I mean, we have too many of those. I like films that that really kind of reveal an interesting subconscious, and then likewise are able to speak to my subconscious, right?
Yeah.
So that's one of the things that I think really jumps out at me from Herzog's films, and one of the reasons I really, really love them. So,
and at the end of the day, to me, it comes down to, in any creative art form, I think sticking to any rule is a mistake. Like sticking into it too
dogmatically,
dogmatically is a mistake, because you find, and we sort of had a similar conversation in our first episode talking about, or in a second, which was talking about film school, where it is, and it kind of comes back to this whole idea of do you just follow those rules steadfast, and then because that's so incredibly constricting,
mindlessly, right? Automatically, if you follow
and I've heard people many times, in a screenplay, in a perfectly good screenplay, not my screenplays, but like screenplays I've written or read with other people, and their complaint has been something like, well, I just didn't see a very clear second act break, and it's like, well, what does that
you're
matter?
like,
what is that? Where does that? Because of course, the story was compelling.
Because my goodness, I mean, if you judged almost all of, or maybe all of Herzog's films in that manner, they would all fail, right? I mean, and so I think it's interesting, and it's especially like I put myself, back into my more unexperienced self, decade ago or 15 years ago. And I remember reading screenwriting books and things and just thinking like, oh, okay, this is what I've got to do. This is how I've got to do it. Or, people who are in film school or something. And yeah, I mean, that can really get you in trouble, thinking that there's just one way to do it, or this is how you have to do it. And and even further, having lived in LA for quite a long time, I mean, there's just so many film schools, screenwriting classes, and everybody seems to know, like, everybody is selling some, like, magic silver bullet for how to write an amazing script. And there's no question I can say that that's horsepucky. Anybody out there listening, if you're kind of just starting out and you see somebody try to sell you like the top 10 secrets on how to write a killer script or something, just run from that. Please, Lord, don't spend your money on anything like that. Run from it, because that's just crap.
Well, I can remember being in this Facebook group for screenwriting. And I remember I had to leave it because it was just so dogmatic. Like, you would post something for feedback, and the people's responses would be something like some people were genuinely helpful, but a lot of people would be like, "Oh, it's your character description doesn't tell me about the man's height or his hair color."
Oh Lord!
And it's like I'm sitting there just with my with my head, my face in my hands, going like, What is this? And I think a lot of that comes from a desire of somebody who, again, because a lot of this does come down at the end of the day to talent. But I think that a lot of the times it's the people that kind of lack that natural talent that go to the rules and go, well, I know the rules really well, so I'm just as good. And so they kind of become dogmatic like that and kind of go like, maybe I can't write a great script, but at least I know the rules, and now I can criticize somebody else's script and make myself feel better because they... their script didn't have action lines like I write them, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of funny.
Yeah.
And even formatting is such a thing that, Herzog does mention that about formatting.
Right.
There's definitely a reason for it, but
writing in prose versus writing, in a perfect script format. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Which I think he kind of mentions in this lesson that, for the vast majority of his career, he just wrote kind of in a novel form in prose, and then only recently that he started to put, use. And I've not read any of his current scripts in original formatting, so I don't know. But it sounds like moving more toward a quote unquote proper script format.
I used to write on Google Docs and have to format every single margin myself, which was hell. But that's how, Paul Thomas Anderson writes like that, apparently still to this day. He writes in Microsoft Word without any plugins, and he formats every single line. And honestly, there was, weirdly enough, a rhythm that you got into when you were doing that. Like, it was like almost like you were operating a machine, like a typewriter.
It's like you're hypnotized. You get into a trance.
I've written on a typewriter, not a full script, but I've played with typewriters before. We used to have one at my school, and I would type on it all the time. It was a lot of fun. But there is kind of that feeling of like operating an old piece of machinery.
It's like a novelty for you. You're like, it's like a typewriter, and I'm like thinking to myself, dude, I remember writing papers in high school on a typewriter. Because
though the best one ever,
it was for fun. It was like that's what we did. Like that's what
my uncle had one that was like one of the ones that you could type out, your entire sentence and then hit print, and it would all print it out. So you didn't have to worry about whiting things out and all that.
Yeah, but had a buffer memory. Yeah,
but no, on that point, there is definitely a kind of, the way I always describe screenwriting to the students that I teach is that it's just as much a technical blueprint and like document about the film as it is a storytelling device. And the best screenwriters will balance both of those things to a point where, reading a screenplay, a really good screenplay, doesn't feel like reading a novel. It feels like there's a rhythm to it. Like you can feel the shots and you can feel the how the lines move into the next ones. And I like, when I write, I don't actually write all that much. I much rather get another person to write for me, and then I kind of tear apart that script and make it my own. But when I do write my own stuff, I really do like to have that rhythm to it, and it's not necessarily the way that a novel is written. It's much more, there's beats. You can feel those action beats, and you can feel almost like the best screenplay makes you feel like you're watching the movie, really. I mean,
well,
that's
this
kind of the
is
basic.
interesting. I think it brings up a couple points, at least kind of peripherally, is that, I mean, it certainly matters like who you're writing the script for. So as we're talking here, we are kind of, you and I are talking about script writing from the assumption that the person writing the script is the director, right? Because, I mean, we're talking about Herzog. He doesn't write scripts for other people. He, and he directs his own scripts. So certainly you have a much, much wider latitude. And I mean, you can write a script however you want if you're going to be the director and if you are financing it, right? If you're funding it, you can write it however the hell you want. So if it works for you, for example, where you write it in screenplay format and it's very visual and it has a very visual rhythm to it, because that's what you need to kind of go back to it and use it as a blueprint for directing, then that's what you do. If you want to write it in a kind of a novel form, then, and that works for you, then that's what you do. And of course, if you're writing a script to try to sell it, if you're writing a script on spec, or then that's a whole different ball game there.
You can't make those choices that are
it's then that's a whole different thing, and you really do have to stick to the to screenplay formatting, and that kind of changes everything up. That really omits a lot of options for you. But yeah, I mean, I think, and that's where, I think, going back to read, I think reading a wide range of literature is important. That will help educate that'll help you find, I think, your own writing style that works for you as you're exercising your imagination, as you read, as you are working to visualize the stories, the characters in the literature that you read. You can start to kind of piece together what works for you. And then, of course, writing. I mean, getting in there and writing, ideally every day, at least some, is a that's, you mentioned talent. I don't know. I might argue a little bit with you there. I don't know really what talent is. I don't even know if talent is a thing that I can't really define or understand. So I kind of just don't think much about it. I think of like just working. If you want to be a writer, write every day, read every day, and just do it. I don't know what inherent talent means or not. Let's say it even does exist. Well, if it is truly inherent and you can't change it or do anything about it, then what does that mean to me anyway? So, just do it. I think sometimes we have a tendency, I certainly know I've done this to myself, where if you start thinking about it in terms of things that you can't control, like, well, there's this like innate thing called talent that's inside of me and it's just what I am. I don't know. I guess I kind of, not to get too far down another track here, but I kind of would just prefer to be like, well, I'm either going to write or I'm not.
Yeah.
So do it or don't. And this whole thing about talent, I don't even want to waste my time thinking about it, because it doesn't feel like it's a definable thing for me, and it's not in my control. So just say bye. I don't know if that makes sense, but
no. I mean, I think of it more in a way of of luck, in that, and some people are just more naturally inclined to be able to do something well, but at the same time, some of those people can be equally as good as somebody who just worked at it. And who didn't have that natural inclination. Yeah. And so it's completely, to me, it's more of it's a moldable thing that might set someone ahead in circumstance, but can be overcome.
Yeah.
But I also think, I mean, just on a general note too, about format and whether or not you should write every one of your movies in a specific format or things like that. The two longest short films that I've made, which each were around 25 minutes or so. They were both written, they were both, neither of them had scripts, neither of them had screenplays. They had documents that had the story in them, but the documents were more like beat sheets or like treatments that just kind of described what went on in the scenes. For specific moments of dialogue, of course, I would write out the dialogue, but as far as exterior forest day, our hero walks into the clearing and pulls his gun and fires it. Like, there was none of that. It was which I think is funny, because for the shorter movies I've done, the short films I've done almost always had formatted screenplays. And then even the feature that I'm coming up on right now is kind of one of those things where, and as Herzog gets into later, where he says, be prepared to throw out your script on the set.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that with my producers we're really talking about. And this is also to be, specifically about this. This is a screenplay that was written by a treatment by somebody else that I then adapted into the screenplay format. So it wasn't even, on that general note, it wasn't even just something that came right out of my own brain. It was an adaptation of another work, technically. And with the producers, we're in this kind of talk right now about like, let's just have fun with the location. If something comes up on location, we're like, that actually might work way better. And I think that a lot of people stress about that, and people see that kind of, be prepared to throw out your script if the dialogue doesn't work, blah, blah, blah.
And especially when you have no budget, which I'm going to assume that, you and I are in that category for the most part. I'm assuming most of our listeners would be, and I think there's no question. I totally agree with you. I mean, unless you're able to build the sets, right? Or lock down any location that you might want. You've got to be willing to do that. You have got to be willing to allow what's available to you. So whether it's costumes, actors, sets, you've got to be able to work with them, not
even
against
weather.
them.
I mean, even something as simple as weather.
Right, because you're just not going to be able to dictate it. And so then your choices are, well, do I work with it or against it, right? And if you are dogmatically sticking with your script and you're not using what's there, you're really cutting off a lot of opportunity for yourself. So,
and I think it's funny to look at it that way too, to look at it in a way of being afraid of it or kind of being against it. Yeah. Because I think that that's one of the most fun aspects of filmmaking. And of course, that's subjective. But like I there's nothing more fun to me than just kind of being with a group of creative people on set, and I think that that's a really nice way to approach it in that, especially working with actors. Like your actors are, if they are not even necessarily if they're trained, you could just have someone who's a great actor who has never had formal training, but work with them, like be able to sit down with them and kind of go, okay, how do you feel? Because if anything, they should know their characters just as well as you know them, and you can then have a conversation about what do we want to do here, what's interesting. And I think Herzog really talks a lot about even his conversations with Nicolas Cage on Bad Lieutenant, where they would have these like long conversations about the character, but it wasn't about scene to scene motivation or things like that, or what do I want in this moment. It was these really general conversations. And another example of that is Sigourney Weaver on Alien. Came from a theatrical background.
I didn't know Herzog directed Alien. Really?
Oh, yeah. It's his lesser known picture.
Did he ghost direct that? I mean, Ridley's name's on it, but yeah. No, sorry.
Ridley Scott doesn't actually exist, but it's just Herzog's pseudonym.
That's Herzog's like more studio blockbuster work.
but he so Sigourney Weaver in that, of course, coming from a stage background, had so much work on the character of Ripley, like this massive binder of just notes that she'd made about this character, that half of that stuff, probably the vast majority of that stuff, never ended up on screen. But I think that as directors and as writers and as actors, and as the kind of core creative team in any movie, that is always going to inform decisions. And I think both of you and I can really speak to this just because we both do have acting backgrounds, where it's like, even if something as simple as, what my character did yesterday never appears on the screen, my knowing that will inform the decisions that I make as that character in each scene. And a lot of that can come from loosening up on your script and kind of giving your actors the opportunity, and your cinematographer even, and anybody the opportunity to kind of go, where do I want to take this?
Well, and I think, to take it from acting back to writing, I mean, boy, and this is a topic we could spend, 1,000 episodes on just writing, of course. And there are podcasts out there that definitely do that. But, a couple things, so talking about problem solving, it just goes back to being able to be flexible and using what you have to tell your story, as opposed to trying to, shoehorn something into what you don't have. I mean, I think filmmaking is, probably 98% problem solving. I mean, especially as a director, certainly in producer as well. I mean, this is what you're doing. Like, it's just a constant stream of having to creatively solve problems. I mean, I've never worked on a film where there weren't just, I mean, every day was just a string of you can call them challenges, you can call them opportunities, but I mean, no matter how well you plan, ultimately you're going to get there, and on the day you're going to have so many decision points. And you can kind of see it as like taking opportunity, or as, just fighting every one of those opportunity points to just, stick to exactly what you've got on the page. And at this level where, at this kind of budget, you can't control all the variables around you. We're not, Christopher Nolan or David Fincher, who can make a $150 million film and control every single variable, and have such a like sanitized set, and then of course in post get to CGI everything the way they want it, So, not that they don't have their own challenges and opportunities and creative problem solving. Of course they do, but I think that. That's such an important thing to remember, is to remain flexible. It's just so key, and to see those as opportunities, and not get caught up. And then you talk about background, or like the homework, the background work that actors do. You mentioned Sigourney Weaver and this huge, Trapper Keeper. I don't know why I said Trapper Keeper. Do you remember Trapper Keepers? Anyway, I just imagine. I imagine Sigourney Weaver. This is like, when was Alien? Was that like 77?
79.
79. So I think about this. Sigourney Weaver. She's young, and she's got this like purple Trapper Keeper filled with all of her alien notes. That's anyway. I don't know where my mind's going, but I just imagine Trapper Keepers were cool. I miss them. I don't know if they're still around, but anyway. Same as a writer, though, right? So, and this is there's a horror film that I'm working on as a producer, and working with the writer of that script. We're going through a handful of rounds of revisions, and such a big part of what we're doing is making sure that there is a universe that this script sits in that extends well beyond the pages. And, I'd be interested to know, Herzog doesn't specifically talk about this, but my guess is that in his mind, he has a universe that these scripts sit in, and he may just keep them in his mind, but I think that's a big part of when he's writing, a script in a novel form. That's a big part of it, is that he, within the writing, there's so much more than what's going to ultimately literally be on screen, but it informs what's on the screen in very important, significant ways. And so in this particular film, the way we're going about that is just, working together as a team to make sure that this universe is consistent, and there's a logic to it, at least within itself, right? And that it exists well beyond just the pages, so that it does inform, so that there's a density and depth of information there on the screen that's compelling, that's interesting, so things make sense and have purpose within its own little weird, funky universe. So, but he doesn't specifically speak to that, but I would have been interested to kind of know, But my guess would be that he's got a lot more there in his head than what you just see on screen. I think that's pretty important. So,
yeah, I mean, and that's a great point, because I think there's that, just kind of like you said, and very much in line with that idea of, an actor knowing what their character did yesterday will inform the decisions they make on that day. Very similarly, you should know the rules of your world and things like that, and the world in which, even if you're writing a drama that takes place in this very real world, there are still, rules, and there are still circumstances outside of your film that will decide factors within it.
As a caveat, I would say, you can go too far though in that direction, where, and I actually have run into this myself, where I've kind of had to stop myself, where you can get really caught up on that, where, okay, the cause effect relationships, the motivations, everything that's happening has this like perfectly rational, literal, train of thought that makes perfect, rational, literal sense. Be really careful about that, because I think that's one of the ways that you can really take away what Herzog's talking about here, which is which is that the reality is that the crazy shit happens in the world all the time, and things are, our human behavior, it can I don't even know how rational it really is. Actually, when you boil it all down, it seems that we're quite emotionally driven. So I don't know. I mean, allow that space for your subconscious, that things may not on face value seem to make sense, or why did this happen, or why did that happen? But I don't know. So just be careful. You can go too far and kind of analyze out. I guess this kind of speaks to the whole.
I think to me, my mantra on that is kind of that the screen supersedes all, if that makes sense. In that,
in what way?
So if I'm writing rules for a world, especially in something like where it doesn't maybe take place in our world, or there's very specific things about like horror or things like that, where okay, these paranormal things do exist. What are the rules around these ghosts? What I always think about in my head is, and a good example of that is the movie It Follows, which a lot of people loved. I thought it was okay, but it was interesting.
It didn't jump out. I heard rave reviews and I watched it and I was
Yeah, it was kind of, it was a fun hour and a half or whatever it was, but I didn't think it was
blow me away.
Yeah, exactly. But it's a great example of like rules in terms of what can this monster do and what can't it do, and there were points, especially near the end of that movie, where they started to get a little fuzzy, and so that's kind of where I mean to think about those things when you're writing, but at the same time, what I mean by the screen supersedes all is if there's something that happens in your movie on screen that breaks one of your rules, but what occurs on the screen makes up for it, or explains it in a way that kind of bumps over it, I don't mind it. It's one of the reasons that one of my least favorite film discourse kind of topics ever is talking about plot holes.
Yeah.
Because I find that so often, if you're watching a movie, you don't notice the plot holes really until you think about it afterwards.
Yeah.
Which sometimes is an issue, but a lot of the times it's like I don't care if I have to wonder why that person chose to drive to that location instead of walk, or vice versa, or
right.
Things like that. I think are so if a great example of that is Hitchcock with I can't remember what movie it was, but Hitchcock tells this story about an actor walking out of a hotel door and looking up at the building across the street, and Hitchcock said, "Don't look up at the building across the street until you get to the curb." And the actor said, "Well, I can see the top of the building from inside the lobby. I don't actually need to walk to the curb." And then Hitchcock said, "Yes, you do need to walk to the curb, because you need to get into the shot and look up so that I can then cut to the shot."
The camera has to be able to see you.
And he was like, and then I have to cut to the shot of the building across, so I have to see you look up. And it's one of those things, right, where it's like logically, I mean, that's not necessarily a plot hole, but logically, yeah, the guy could see the building from inside. But sometimes, and that's kind of what I mean when I say the screen supersedes all, that there's logic that occurs within the way a camera, captures a scene or a visual that might not fit with the logic of your script. And I usually try to focus on the logic of that camera, because at the end of the day, that's what people are going to be seeing of your film is what the final camera captured.
Yeah, well, and it's just too, you talk about plot holes. I mean, I would imagine that if any one of us looked at our own lives, even our actual real lives may have quite a few seemingly plot holes to an outside viewer. I imagine quite a few, but even insanity kind of has its own logic and rules. But it's not something that we could dive into to the extent to which the subject might demand it. But but it is just something to think about and to kind of look at. And find your own technique in writing, and maybe try both if you're kind of just starting off as a writer, to just see what you can do. Sit down but let's kind of like segue then into that. Like, okay, so we've talked about it kind of philosophically, but Herzog talks about how he actually logistically writes in this lesson. And for him, he talks about really psyching himself up, and this like really speaks to me, because again, this is one of the scariest aspects of filmmaking to me. So psyching myself up is kind of key. But he talks about how he gets inspired he starts off by reading, what he considers high caliber writing, and he works himself up into, he uses the word fury, and he's playing Beethoven loudly, and, this, oftentimes on repeat, the same song over and over and over. And he says that this carries him along, and that he likes to write really fast. And he talks about writing entire scripts in, 2-5 days. What are your thoughts on that? And how does that contrast or align with your process, Colin?
I mean, I think it's really. I think everyone again has their own method, and so but I do kind of align with that. I listen to in very different ways. So, like for the documentary that I'm doing right now, that's just rapping on the score. I wrote that by listening to Heinrich Gorecki.
Wait, Colin, you're rapping on the score?
I am rapping, yeah.
Can you give us a few measures?
Well, I mean, lay down a beat for me, Clark, later. But no, that when I sat down, I listened to Gorecki and his Symphony Number 3, and I wrote pretty much the entire, which is like this tragic, beautiful piece with this operatic singer over it, and I wrote the entire narration on that. Over that score, and then there were other very literal times where I've written, I wrote an entire script that was like kind of almost a Herzog thriller, this feature-length script to Stravinsky's The Firebird.
Let's go back. I'm curious. I'm genuinely curious. I want to take you back even before this. So I'm just curious. It's always interesting to kind of hear other people's creative process. Herzog shared his with us, but I'm just kind of curious. I mean, before you even get to that point, is there anything that you do, any kind of... I'm kind of big on rituals. We could talk about this, but I'm curious for you. I mean, do you just like grab a laptop, sit down on a couch and start writing, or do you have a space? Do you write at a consistent time of the day, or is it all over the place?
I mean, I don't come up with ideas. I think that's okay. Kind of my main...
Well, what do you mean by that? You don't come up with
anytime I come up with something, a screenplay or whatever, it's from something that I've seen. So it's not something that I've thought of. Like, I'm not somebody that thinks up these things in the shower and then goes like, I got to write that down. It's always so. An example is that the Hitchcock kind of not parody, but the Hitchcock styled movie I just did, that short kind of experiment. I came up with that because I was standing at my window one night and a bus pulled up and then drove away, and I thought, oh, it'd be kind of neat if someone like got off that bus who I knew was coming to either kill me or something like that.
Wait, and you don't call that coming up with an idea? Like,
sure. I mean,
no.
I
but
mean,
this is
technically,
curious. But this is curious to me. Okay, hold on. This is interesting. Let's explore this for a second. So you're saying, we're using you as an example because I think so many people are challenged by this process. So we use ourselves as guinea pigs and kind of to contrast and compare to what Herzog talked about in the lesson, but. So it's interesting that you said I'm not the kind of person who comes up with ideas. And then you go on to describe how you're standing in front of your window and you see a bus go by and your imagination takes off and you're like, well, what if, this person got off the bus and they were here to kill me? And then it kind of blossoms from that. I'm curious, why do you feel like that's not coming up with ideas? Like, that's interesting to me.
I see more of it as like the world generating those ideas for me. Because I'm not somebody who can sit, I've got friends who can sit down at a laptop and just throw something out,
just rattle off,
just rattle off a story. Whereas I'm someone who very much more like will kind of be signaled those ideas, and maybe that's one of the reasons that I prefer to get other people's scripts given to me for something to direct, because I then once I've got that starting point, I can go all over and I can
tweak it,
start generating ideas on my own, and go, what if we do this instead of that, and things like that. But when it comes to the creation of those ideas, it's usually something occurring out of my control that I go, that's really neat. Even another example of that is the movie that I made for Herzog's Masterclass back in 2016.
Way back.
Was created because I was taking in groceries from the car one day, and I thought, wouldn't that be weird if, and there was a car sitting outside of my house, and I thought, wouldn't that be weird if, I was taking in groceries and I came back outside and that car had been following me the day before, and it's like, oh no, now it's at my house. And that was the basis of that story that I wrote and that turned into a movie. And it always also involves music, which is weird in that, like, normally what will happen is something like that, and then I will sit down and kind of start listening to music that it reminds me of. So again, like I said, the Stravinsky, The Firebird, that whole Screenplay came out because I can't remember exactly what had triggered that thought. There was something with a pen. I remember I saw a pen somewhere, and I went, that could be like a neat plot device if that pen had something inside of it, which is funny. But then I wrote this whole thing on the Firebird by Stravinsky, because that was the music that I kind of popped into my head, or even the screenplay that I'm refining and tweaking with right now, that for the feature that I'm directing, was Gordon Lightfoot, which is very different than Stravinsky's The Firebird. Yes, but I just was slightly listening to, especially because Gordon Lightfoot, of course, is from Northern Ontario, which is where we are going to be shooting this movie, and it just felt appropriate that I listened to Gordon Lightfoot for that, and it's interesting though.
Now, so it sounds like you've mentioned a couple examples where you're inspired by, seemingly benign or mundane life things, which I think is very common. And I think Herzog mentions earlier in one of the lessons somewhere being inspired, taking what Herzog talks about specifically, I think like for Fitzcarraldo, where, he took one small little piece, which is the steamship being pulled over the mountain, out of what he considered an otherwise totally boring narrative, and made a film around that. So, I mean, do you ever find... So, in other words, I feel like inspiration, of course, is everywhere. It can be in that pen that's sitting on the table. It can be in the bus that pulls in front of your window. It can also be in other works. Do you ever find yourself specifically inspired in other stories and literature or films? Because I very much do.
Absolutely, yeah.
Which is just one more reason to read, right? One more reason to read. Yeah.
The first screenplay I ever wrote, full feature-length screenplay I ever wrote, was right after I had read those Zodiac documents, as I mentioned in the last episode about reading. I read that full file, and then I wrote, and that was a combination of that, and then I watched Fincher's Zodiac, and I kind of got this idea. So very much so is the the kind of synthesis of those two things that came into something that was new and fresh.
Now, when you write, do you have any kind of do you have a space that you've set up? Do you ritualize anything? Do you have a time of day? Because we can kind of talk a little bit about some of these things. But for you, is any of that a part of your kind of regular creative process? No?
In fact, the most successful writing, stint I've done lately was when I wrote, I think, 65 or 70 pages in a day, and I was sitting on a chair.
That's Herzog style.
I was so uncomfortable the whole time too, but I just could not. My fingers just wouldn't. I was like,
that's awesome.
Constantly like, I should probably go and sit somewhere that'll be more comfortable. But I figured that might ruin the rhythm I had going. But
that urgency that Herzog talks about.
But no, I think it's interesting is in contrast with what you said, where you said that you like that kind of ritual, that pattern, whereas I don't find that at all. If I have something creative, I'll, even if I'm on a bus, I'll pull out my phone and immediately start writing something in a notes document on my iPhone.
Well, and that's, I'm going to, for myself, it's something that I run into quite a bit, right? It's like, you're not in control of when you're inspired necessarily, right? And so I guess it depends on the extent to which you want to write. But for me, if I relied only upon, if I only wrote when I was inspired to do so, I wouldn't do a whole lot of writing. And so, especially to push myself through, a 120-page script. Because, even if my original idea was inspired, I have never had it be the case that that inspiration just carried me through an entire 120 pages without any dips, right? It just never happened for me. And so it's interesting, Herzog, and maybe that's part of, I obviously never want to speak for him, but just kind of imagining, he mentions urgency as such a vital aspect of his process. And I wonder if that's part of it. It's that, when you have that inspiration, write it like you did with that 60 pages. You're like, I don't even want to move off this uncomfortable chair, because if I stop this, if I let this go, it might run away from me. So... also I think writing with great urgency, it kind of, it forces you to separate the editing and the writing process. Now, Herzog, it's another aspect of his writing. He talks about, he alludes to, that he doesn't touch his stuff after he writes it, which is kind of wild to me, and it's definitely not my process. But you know, when you write, it's kind of that old adage, write drunk, edit sober, right? Where he even has a story where wasn't he writing on a, I don't think he was necessarily drunk. I can't remember if he was or not, but he's writing in this bus full of soccer or football players, and everybody's, you know, throwing up and everything. But it's you know, for me. I think it, you know, maybe the take home for people is not that this is an advice podcast by any means, but, you know, to try a bunch of different stuff. I mean, I'm still trying. It's like sometimes I find like ritualizing it works, where I have, you know, I will read literature for 15, 30 minutes to kind of separate myself from the day, you know, to separate myself from all of the little, you know, the work issues or just life issues and things, to kind of, you know, to take me into a different mental state. It's almost like a meditation, right? And then I have a space that I've set up that I write with, or I write in. And sometimes too, for stretches, it'll be a specific time of day that I will write. So I know to prepare myself for this thing with my rituals. And that works for some people, and so maybe it's worth trying. But yeah, you know, for me, it's like, boy, if you are somebody who is regularly inspired to the point where you have the energy to write a script, I am jealous of you. But it's just not that way for me. Even if the initial idea is inspired, it's a process. It's like a very, you know, and it's often tedious for me. So I've not been able to get to the place where Herzog is, where he is able to write a script in 5 days and he doesn't worry about it. My process is very different. Maybe I should put more time into trying the way Herzog writes, but
I mean, again, it's one of those things too, that once you have that amount of control over your project's totality, you can kind of make those decisions. I think as an independent filmmaker, if I went to a producer and said, I wrote this script, it's the first draft, and this is what we're going with, I'd be laughed out of the building, and I'd be requested at you know, to go and write a new draft.
This kind of will be an interesting segue into the next lesson, which will be our next episode, which is financing first films. But I would argue that at both ends of your career, you kind of have this power, right? So right now, I'm not writing anything for a studio. I'm not.
I suppose, the risks are low.
I'm not trying to sell anything. Like I'm writing to direct, produce my own film with my own money, or, you know, private investors or whatnot that we've gotten. And so I may be beholden to them in some sense, but I control that because I set that up. I say, you know, you're investing in this, but it's not like you're going to dictate the script or the story or et cetera, or how we tell it. So you have control over that. And certainly if you use your own money, which, like I said, Herzog talks about in the next lesson, I mean, you do have that control.
Yeah.
You do. And we can talk about this at different points throughout and in the next episode and the next lesson. But, you know, what your goals are really important. And we could let's talk about that actually a little bit here with writing. You know, what motivates you as a filmmaker, as an artist, is so important. If you sit down to write because you want to be a famous director, because you want to break into the Hollywood system and be a cog in that machine, those are kind of loaded words. It's not that there's anything wrong, of course, with working within the studio system at all, but, you know, it really does make a difference about how you approach this. If you are writing a script because you have a story that's burning inside of you to tell, and you have to tell it, and you're going to direct it, I mean, and you're going to finance it, it's such a different beast, right?
Yeah.
Than if you're sitting down like, okay, I want to be the next Quentin Tarantino, and I've got to write a script that a reader at this literary agent's office is going to be, you know, is going to think is great, and
totally blown away by,
and then I'm going to get into the Hollywood system, and I'm going to be the next big director. I mean, being motivated consciously by those kind of goals, I think produces such a radically different film.
Oh yeah, I mean, unless you're a spec script writer full time, I would say write for yourself. Like, even if you're,
I would argue. I mean, I would say always write for yourself. I mean, I guess that's kind of my point. Is that, and this is what speaks to me about Herzog, is that, his films, he's always writing from the place of, and he uses different analogies, like the robber that's in your house, right? That the story, he can't not tell the story. He can't not tell the story. He's got to tell the story. And so, and again, just kind of, I think Herzog, the way he lives his life, the way, like when we're talking about a philosophy of living and of art, it's living in a way where you can open yourself to the world to such an extent that you can be inspired, to create something so intensely that it's like all you care about is telling this story. You're not motivated by fame and fortune and prestige and, all these things. Maybe those things will come to you in time, but it's almost kind of,
they're always going to come naturally, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Right? It's not going to, you're not going to be able to force that.
Yeah, and I guess I'm speaking just to this to some extent because just of my time in Los Angeles and kind of being exposed to that whole that whole mess. And maybe we could just do some podcasts, some episodes on that whole experience and all the stories I've got from that alone. But I mean, it is really, it does, and maybe if you're sitting out there listening and you've not kind of been a part of that machine, it might be harder to understand how easily you can get sucked into that. And it really does have a profound impact on your creative process, right? Because all of your motivations and intentions moving into writing and are so changed by, if your goal is to try to make it. And it's just, I think that's one of the things that really, really, really stands out to me about Herzog, that really I gravitate to him for that. It's a reminder to try to stay pure and focus on the story as opposed to other external goals of success. But anywho, so yeah, well, I think we've pretty much covered most of the stuff that
that's a great place to
of the content that was in Herzog's fourth lesson. So, do you have any other anything that we missed? Any other final words, Cullen?
No, I
as
think
we
just
wrap
I
up
think
this episode.
I think that all sums it up really sufficiently.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, hey, at least as much as we can do in this episode, right? Of course, boy, screenwriting could be, it
an entire it is. I'm pretty sure there are podcasts based on
there are that have hundreds and hundreds of episodes.
Yeah.
Which I always imagine. I always imagine Herzog. It's so funny. Because here he is, like, look, don't overanalyze it, don't intellectualize it, don't get out of your head, get into your body, and do this thing. And so I'm always kind of I feel like Herzog's looking over my shoulder, his little head floating here above me, saying, "What are you doing?" Just right. But anyway, all right.
Yeah.
So cool. Well, thank you so much, Cullen, for your time this afternoon. As always, it's been a blast. And for everybody out there listening, I hope that our ramblings have been enjoyable and have maybe given you something to think about. So we look forward to seeing you next week, where we will cover at Lesson 5, Financing First Films. Until then, everybody, have a wonderful week. We'll catch you on the flip side.
See you guys. Bye.